Hi, I'm Michelle Zuby, a Board Certified Behavior Analyst at DiNovi & Associates. The discussion around private events, where they fit into the scope of our practice, and how we address them as clinicians is still to be determined. I'm going to highlight an article from nearly 20 years ago that explored the role of private events within the paradigm of human behavior. This relates to task list items E3, E6, and G7. In 2000, the Behavior Analyst published an article by Anderson, Hawkins, Freeman, and Scotti titled, "Private Events, Do They Belong in the Science of Human Behavior?" I'm going to focus on this article in particular, however, I will also highlight more current research and opposing viewpoints. The work of Anderson and colleagues introduces papers from a symposium that reviewed the roles of private events in the science of human behavior. The authors examined how the role of private events are assigned in several behavioral orientations and discussed how private events may be conceptualized within a behavior analytic framework. Private events, covert behaviors, physiological responses and feelings, these instances of behavior that are not readily available or observable for data collection often appear as being mentalistic and are the source of much debate when it comes to the field of behavior analysis. Anderson and colleagues point out that few would argue that these events do not occur. However, their role in the science of behavior has yet to be clearly defined. They posture that there are three main points of focus. Number one, should private events be included in the science of human behavior, at least on a philosophical or theoretical level? Two, do these private events affect our overt behavior in any significant way? And third, should the analysis and attempted modification of private events be included in the applied part of our science? The authors respond to these questions by offering different perspectives for us as behavior analysts to explore, and by evaluating how the different schools of behaviorism deal with private events, describing how behavior analysis has attempted to address this behavior, and by examining different approaches for conceptualizing the role of private events in human behavior. The authors define thoughts and feelings as English language names for events that are at least partly unobservable by the usual kinds of interactions between people. This definition is meant to refer to behaviors, for example, such as thinking, that occur within a person. They suggest that the terms should be considered separate from the actual events or phenomena. We certainly do not wish to imply that they are necessarily best considered as two distinct classes of events, or especially that feelings are best considered as falling into the socially defined classes named by the popular terms for various emotions, such as remorse, guilt, anger, resentment, or joy. Any classification of private events should be based on the natural science evidence available. Anderson and colleagues present questions for us to consider with regards to private events. Does behavior include only events that are observable by more than one individual, or does it include other events as well? In psychology, as a study of behavior, should private events and other events that occur at the neurological level constitute as behavior in the absence of muscular movement? They then present an overview of the three types of behaviorism: methodological behaviorism, cognitive behaviorism, and radical behaviorism. From the methodological behaviorism perspective, psychology is the study of behaviors that are observable by others. This was a shift away from the mentalistic interferences of a psychology to move towards observable responses and the role of environmental influences in determining those responses. By this account, private events are not denied from existence, but rather are eliminated from the study because they are not observable by people other than those who emit them. Conversely, cognitive behaviorism does include the study of unobservable events and processes, and holds that cognitive events exist and that they mediate overt behavior and learning. Some cognitive behavior researchers have found people respond to cognitive representations of their environment rather than to the actual environment. Cognitive processes are said to play a role in producing, predicting, and understanding behavior. Cognitive events and processes include thinking and feeling, in addition to hypothetical structures, memories, and information processing networks. The third wave of behaviorism is radical behaviorism, also known as behavior analysis, which differs in methodology regarding to the role of environment on behavior. The distinction of the radical perspective of private events made by the authors is that radical behaviorism is based on a monastic view of behavior. No distinction is made between external physical responses and those responses that occur within the body. Instead, all responses, public or private, are viewed as natural physical events, many of which are observable, even if only by the person emitting them. In other words, there need not be an agreement between two or more people that the event has occurred, and the private events must only be observable to the person experiencing them. For example, thoughts or a headache. Skinner offered that these events are distinguishable from the hypothesized structures and processes of the non-physical world that have been called mentalism. Private responses are inclusive of verbal thoughts, private perceptions such as visual and auditory images, and the private aspects of emotional responding, and not include hypothetical structures such as a fear network within the phobic stimuli and responses are organized. For many of us in practice, we focus strictly on the overt, observable, and measurable aspects of behavior without taking into account behaviors that are unseen. Skinner, along with other researchers, have suggested private events to be an integral part of our behavioral science. But the research on what the roles should be is scant, and little has been done to bring us closer to an answer. Now, this is not to say that nothing has been done. Some work has been done in more recent times to examine this phenomenon. For instance, Calklin's 2002 paper on inner behavior, empirical investigations of private events. Baum's 2011 Behaviorism, Private Events, and the Molar View of Behavior, which presented an opposing view to Anderson and colleagues. It can be understood by this statement. The real solution to the problem of privacy is to see that private events are unnecessary to understanding behavior. They might or might not exist. They are irrelevant. A complete account of behavior can be had without them. Palmer's 2011 Consideration of Private Events is required in a comprehensive science of behavior, where he suggests that Baum misunderstood the role of private events and offered. Also added to this body of research are Leland's 2014 paper Contingency Horizon on Private Events and the Analysis of Behavior. Stocko, Thompson, and Hart, 2014, Teaching Tacting of Private Events Based on Public Accompaniments, Effects of Contingencies, Audience Control, and Stimulus Complexity. Teaching Metaphorical Extensions of Private Events Through Rival Model Observation to Children with Autism by Dixon and colleagues, 2017. And even a publication in the Journal of Experimental Behavior Analysis in 2017 by Racklin titled, Is Talking to Yourself Thinking? This is by no means an exhaustive review of the literature. However, in comparison to other aspects of our science, the body of research on private events is meager at best. Anderson and colleagues pointed out a major flaw in our field that still holds true today. Behavior analysts almost totally ignore all private events, not even differentiating between private responses and private stimuli. They came to this conclusion upon reviewing subject indices of texts on the basic principles of behavior. These included Catania, 1998, Donahue and Palmer, 1994, Grant and Evans, 1994, Malott, Whaley, and Malott, 1997, and Pierce and Epling, 1995. These texts were reviewed to search for concepts on either thinking or emoting. What they found was that only Catania, 1998, had any discussion on thinking, while some of the others made mention about private or covert behavior or cognition. A similar review of texts on human behavior, which included Chance, 1998, Kasdan, 1994, Martin and Pear, 1996, Miltenberger, 1997, and Serafino, 1996, yielded similar results. The authors illustrate a clear discrepancy both in the basic and applied approach to private events. Again, this article is from 2000, but I used several of these textbooks in my coursework only a few years ago. By now you may see that there is a discrepancy here. To further illustrate, Anderson and colleagues expand on this point with a discussion on emotions, in particular anxiety, and how it's a commonly treated disorder within clinical psychology. In review of those same texts, they found that only Catania 1998 contained anything on emotion, and it was limited. Upon review of those same 5 books on behavior modification, it was found that emotion is covered from 0 to 6 pages, with the most being found in Martin and Pear, 1996. Based on the scarcity of information on private events, the authors ask if behavior analysts do not consider emotional behavior important, and question further if it is because the topic is too difficult for behavior analysis at present, or is it because behavior analysts generally take little interest in respondent relations, which certainly are involved in emotional behavior, or is there some other reason? Anderson and colleagues stress that regardless of the reasons why, we are neglecting a major area of study and theory while also limiting the scope of our practice. They discern that even veteran behavior analysts struggle using a behavior analytic perspective to describe the relations between private events and overt behaviors. Anderson and colleagues surmise that the confusion about private events has led to an avoidance of them. This avoidance, in their opinion, has limited both the theoretical and conceptual underpinnings of our work and has given the impression that our field is unwilling or incapable of dealing with these behaviors. Again, there have been and continue to be behavior analysts who do research the implications of private events their role, and their influence on overt behavior, but it is merely not enough. It has been recommended that research be conducted with a focus on delineating the relations between private responses and overt responses, and on how private responses and their stimulus properties might be dealt with in applied work. Perhaps this can be more clearly understood through the example Anderson provides us about a couple in marital counseling. A couple goes to see a therapist, and based on the clinician's assessment, he suggests that the wife needs to voice her opinions and preferences more. This recommendation was based on the premise of there being numerous situations where the wife's interests would be better served if she spoke up, and ultimately her husband's interests as well. In turn, the clinician teaches the wife to privately rehearse what she will say before she says it, so that she can not only practice saying things in promising ways, but can also sense, as private stimuli, the likely consequences of alternative things to say and ways to say them. The authors support that this is a sensible intervention for a clinical behavior analyst, but behavior analytic literature does not discuss the roles of private events, which in turn makes it difficult to describe such an intervention or its effects to the behavior analytic community. In looking for the roles that private events may play, the authors offer the following. First, private responses sometimes might be viewed as merely collateral to overt behavior and of no functional significance. Second, private responses as stimuli sometimes may be best viewed as causal events, as discriminative or motivative antecedents. And third, which they suggest as a middle ground, private events might be viewed most usefully as stimuli that at times are functionally related to the occurrence of overt behavior. Let's for a moment entertain the hypothesis that private responses occur but have no functional role. In the couple example, the wife who privately rehearses what she wants to say before engaging in overt behavior, we could say that the overt stimuli of the therapist's instruction set the occasion for both her talking to her husband and her private rehearsal, but that the rehearsal had no effect on her overt talk. And even though the private behavior of rehearsing occurred before the overt vocal verbal behavior, it did not have an impact on her overt behavior. Anderson suggests that this position is the one that is more compatible with the behavior methodology, and one would have to further evaluate the private events as they appear to only be dependent variables, and this provides no explanation for why we think. She goes on to say, it seems unlikely that humans would acquire private behavior at all if it were not functional. Another hypothesis from the psychology paradigm is that private events are a primary cause of overt behavior, but the authors state that this notion has implications as well. Behavior analytically speaking, this perspective does not identify environmental variables of which the overt behavior is a function. Furthermore, they offer that this is problematic as well because it does not specify the external, measurable, and potentially manipulable environmental variables that affect both the woman's overt and covert behavior. The third alternative is to consider private responses as dependent variables. For example, when we hear ourselves talk or see images through visualization, they suggest that these private responses may affect overt behavior. They maintain the stance that if private behavior were not functionally important, then humans would not acquire it and continue to emit it. So they continue to search for the answer to what role these private responses play by exploring the following perspectives. One is that private responses exert discriminative stimulus control over subsequent responses. And the other is that private responses might be best accounted for as contingency specifying stimuli. Let's take a look at private events as discriminative stimuli. It seems possible that a private event may set the occasion for another response, which could be public or private. However, the authors only focus on overt responses in this paper. They suggest that control develops either through direct training, where a particular overt response was more likely to be reinforced in the presence, but not in the absence of that private response, or as a result of the private response participating in equivalence relation with an external stimulus that exerted discriminative control over the overt response. Going back to the wife example, it could be argued that these private responses exerted stimulus control over her overt behavior. This may be an incomplete explanation for behavior analysts unless the relation between the therapist's instructions and the woman's private behavior and some direct influence on the instructions on her overt behavior are accounted for. The authors highlight that several behavior analysts have suggested private events might acquire discriminative control over some responses but not others, such as self-instructions, if one strictly adheres to the definition of a discriminative stimulus, which is defined as an antecedent stimulus that sets the occasion for a response because in the past, reinforcement was likely to occur in the presence, but not the absence of that stimulus. So for the wife, if private rehearsing is the discriminative stimulus, then it must signal the availability of reinforcement, which must be available when rehearsal occurs, but not when it does not. It could be said that if she vocalizes, more behavior will result in reinforcement. But the bigger point here is that reinforcement is available for emitting that response whether she rehearses or not. This does not then make sense that a discriminative stimuli would be appropriate here. But what about private events as contingency specifying stimuli? Contingency specifying stimuli, or rules, are stimuli that affect the function of other stimuli and do so by describing at least two components of a contingency. They describe the relation between antecedent stimuli, behavior, and consequences, between antecedent stimuli and behavior, between behavior and consequences, or between two or more stimuli. Schlinger and Blakely, 1987, discussed how contingency specifying stimuli alter the function of other stimuli in multiple ways, one of which is by altering discriminative relations, which may establish a new relation between a response and a previously neutral stimulus, resulting in that stimulus acquiring evocative functions. So the rehearsal would alter the discriminative effect of a previously neutral stimulus under this discriminative control. The rehearsal is acted like a rule which indicates what behavior should be evoked by her husband's action to yield the most favorable consequence. The authors conclude that there are several and differing positions on how private events might be conceptualized within a behavior analytic framework, and they state that these positions are not mutually exclusive. They are in agreement with private events at times serving as discriminative stimuli by directly evoking other behavior, but posture that a more accurate account of the role of private events is to be understood through contingency specifying stimuli. In closing, they remind us that this paper was intended to inspire the conversation about private events and that they only offered mere suggestions on the roles of these events. Research on private events continues to emerge, and we can continue to be inspired by the work of Anderson and colleagues. Skinner, 1957, wrote, "There is no reason why methods of thinking and of the teaching of thinking cannot be analyzed and made more effective."